Welcome to the Archive of Nations, whom are the custodians of the sacred records from time immemorial. Please subscribe and press the notification button, as we have many lessons to educate and empower with a correct narrative of the past to create a lawful blueprint for the future. Welcome to webisode 10 of Series 1, The Fallacy of Greece and Rome, entitled Hellenes, and the Draconian Demon Race. Western academics, their institutions, media outlets, and edited dictation aka education systems all promote that ancient Greece is the foundation of Western civilization. As we have shown with the previous 9 webisodes thus far, is that this is nothing but pure fallacy, and Western civilization was built by carbon organic families, tribes, and clans from Africa, such as the Ethiopians, Egyptians, Libyans, Cushites, and all other tribes of the great continent. Alternatively, you also had Phoenicians, Persians, Elamites, Babylonian Cushites, and Sumerians from Mesopotamia, whom were also carbon organic families, tribes, and clans. The hybrid Asian albino did not appear, as we have shown, until 2000 BC in the Anatolian and Balkan regions, and when he did appear, he was an uncivilized, uncultured nomadic barbarian. Ancient Pelasgic Greece was already occupied by carbon organic tribes on their arrival, so whom were these nomads who descended upon the region, and how and when did they become known as Hellenes or Ionians, of which they still lay claim unto this day? The Archive of Nations will set the record straight on the origins of these usurpers and explore what is meant by they are the founders of Western civilization and democracy. During the Dark Ages of Greece, the old major settlements were abandoned, with the notable exception of Athens, and the carbon organic population dropped dramatically as they left the region. Linear B, the language of the scribes and bureaucrats that exercised so much power in the Mycenaean palaces, disappeared, as did all writing, and the monumental construction had also ceased due to the invasion of the hybrid Asian albinos. The Hellenes and smaller tribes mixed amongst themselves for many generations, as the carbon organic tribes had either began migrating out of the region, were left in small pockets and towns, or had already been absorbed into the wider population. This left behind a racially mixed multitude of tribes with both dominant and recessive genealogy. During the 300 years of so-called Dark Ages, the Hellenes and Ionians lived in small groups that moved constantly in accordance with their new pastoral lifestyle and livestock needs, while they left no written records behind, leading to the conclusion that they were illiterate. It is said that later in the Dark Ages, between 950 and 750 BC, Greeks relearned how to write once again, but this time, instead of using the Linear B script used by the Mycenaeans, they adopted the alphabet used by the Phoenicians, innovating in a fundamental way by introducing vowels as letters. The Greek version of the alphabet eventually formed the base of the alphabet used for English today. With the collapse of Mycenaean society and the disappearance of writing, we have very little evidence for events and daily life in Dark Age Greece. What we do have, however, are Homer's epic poems, the Odyssey and the Iliad, some of the oldest works of literature in the so-called Western world. Though the form in which they come down to us was probably influenced by later generations of Greeks, early forms of these poems were recited by bards in Dark Age Greece. Thus, though they purport to record earlier events from the Mycenaean period and earlier, and they were probably changed and updated in later times, Homer's poems likely originated in the Greek Dark Ages, and therefore tell us something about Greek society in that period. As Greek literature begins to emerge in this period, all stories were transmitted orally. Bards had sung the stories of heroes and events like the Trojan War for generations. Now such stories became more standardized, and people may have already begun writing them down. Though the Iliad and the Odyssey are attributed to Homer, they took shape as oral tales that were passed down through the generations, and they evolved over a long period of time. Around the end of the 8th century, Hesiod wrote Works and Days, a treatise on farming and economics and a practical guide for a Greek farmer in charge of his own kleros. He also wrote the Agony, a myth-filled description of the beginning of the world, the gods, and Greek religious customs. Hesiod's works, like Homer's, represented the gods as anthropomorphized, that is, they represented the gods as looking and thinking like humans, though they were immortal. These immortals that they were speaking of were the carbon organic founders of their civilizations from a time long remembered in tale and legend, whom were speaking of the carbon organic Egyptians, Ethiopians, and Cushites from Africa in the south, and the Phoenicians and Persians and other carbon organic tribes, families and clans of ancient Sumer from the east, as we have covered in the previous webisodes. But who were these nomadic tribes whom were the foundation of Hellenistic Greece, referred to as Hellenes and Ionians? First, let's take a look at the Hellenes and the root of the word Hellenes being hell, from the Old English hell, helle, meaning netherworld, abode of the dead, infernal regions, place of torment for the wicked after death, from the Proto-Germanic haljo, meaning the underworld. Literally concealed place. Compare Old Norse heller, cave, cavern, from Proto-Indo-European root kill, to cover, conceal, save, and also the Old Norse hell, from Proto-Germanic haligio, one who covers up or hides something. In this root we find some interesting truths, the first being cave or cavern, as the Yamnaya steppe herders, which are the root of the Indo-Europeans Hellenes, descended from the Caucasus mountain range of the Russian steppe and were isolated in the caves and caverns within that mountain range during the last glacial epoch. We also find the root Proto-Indo-European word kill, from which the Greek language descends today, meaning to cover or conceal, and in the Germanic one who conceals. The reality is what they were concealing is the carbon organic origins of humanity and all carbon organic civilizations that existed before their origins, as their descendants still do to this day. It is also interesting to note the relationship between the hybrid albino Asians, referred to as Hellenistic Greeks, and that they share the same culture as the Germans, being that they share the same mythology. All of their mythology is the same, and so is their religious and spiritual systems. This is why the Germans have the same similar names, such as Helen, the Greek goddess, and Hel, the German goddess. Hel is the goddess of the furthest section of the Nephilim, the realm of the dead in Norse mythology. We will explore in later episodes the origins, role, and extent of the Germans in hiding and concealing the African origins of civilization in the 18th century alongside their British counterparts. The Homeric catalogue of ships speaks of Achilles' kingdom as follows in Homer, Illinois. 2.680-5. Now again all those who dwelt in Pelasgic Argos, those who dwelt in Alos and Alope and Trachis, and those who held Thia and Hellas with its fair women, and who were called Myrmidons and Hellenes and Achaeans. Of those 50 ships the leader was Achilles. You will notice the Argos was the home of the carbon organic Pelasgians, and those who held Thia and Hellas were fair, once more confirming the home of the hybrid Asian albinos. Also Hellenes, the name by which the Greeks called, and still call, themselves, was the territorial name Hellas, and appears to have been confined to an area south of the river Spercheios, in the vicinity of Thermopylae, which means hot gates, and is a narrow pass in Lamia, Greece. It derives its name from its hot sulfur springs, and in Greek mythology the hot gates is one of the entrances to Hades, who is also god of the dead in Greek mythology. The Greece depicted in these poems is politically divided into many small kingdoms, each with farmland and several towns. Such a territory was called a demos, and was led by a ruler known as a basileia. A retinue of bodyguards, called hetairoi, meaning companions, would follow the king and often engaged in minor warfare with neighboring kings, raiding their lands and stealing their livestock. Before we go further, let's take a look at the root of the word demos, meaning common people, originally district, from Proto-Indo-European demo, meaning division, from root de, to divide. This root is also found in the word demon, being Greek daimon, deity, divine power, lesser god, guiding spirit, tutelary deity, sometimes including souls of the dead. And remember, the home of the Hellas was at the entrance to Hades, god of the dead. From the Proto-Indo-European daimon, meaning divider, provider, from root de, to divide. The de is provided by Sanskrit, a language within the Indic languages, meaning deity, cuts, divides, Greek demos, people, land, perhaps literally division of society. This division of society, which was taking place, was the division between the carbon organic progenitors on the continent and this new stock of hybrid Asian albinos, referred to as Ionian Hellenes. Among this warrior elite, within the position of basileia, honor was of principal importance, and it was gained through bravery in battle, piety toward the gods, and keeping one's word. The basic social unit in this society was the household. Kinship ties were essential. Each household had a plot of land sufficient for the family. The land would remain a family inheritance passed down along the male line. As we have discussed in previous webisodes, the ancient carbon organic tribes, families, and clans were matriarchal, yet the Hellenes, aka those of Yamnaya stepherder ancestry, were patriarchal, as we will see in the manifestation of their religions and gods. The plots of land differed in size. Most families had a small household that was enough to sustain them, and only required the work of the family members and perhaps a few slaves, while the powerful had large plots that brought them great wealth and required numerous slaves. Over time, the strict class instituted by the carbon organic hierarchies, scribes and bureaucrats, and hereditary rule were forgotten and gradually replaced with new socio-political institutions that eventually allowed for the rise of democracy in 5th century BC Athens. Hellos, meaning marshland or swamp, was a town of ancient Laconia, situated east of the mouth of the Eurotas, close to the sea, in a plain which, though marshy near the coast, is described by Polybius as the most fertile part of Laconia. On its conquest by the Dorians, its inhabitants were reduced to slavery, and, according to a common opinion in antiquity, their name became the general designation of the Spartan bondsmen, Helots, but the name of these slaves, probably signified captives, is also mentioned by Thucydides. The Helots were a subjugated population that constituted a majority of the population of Laconia and Messenia, the territories ruled by Sparta. Critias described Helots as slaves to the utmost, whereas according to Pollux, they occupied a status between free men and slaves. Tied to the land, they primarily worked in agriculture as a majority and economically supported the Spartan citizens. The number of Helots in relation to Spartan citizens varied throughout the history of the Spartan state. According to Herodotus, there were 7 Helots for each Spartan at the time of the Battle of Plataea in 479 BC. Thus, the need to keep the Helot population in check and prevent rebellion was one of the main concerns of the Spartans. Helots were ritually mistreated and humiliated. Every autumn, the Spartan polis declared war on the Helots, allowing them to be killed and abused by members of the Cryptia without fear of religious repercussion. The Cryptia, also referred to as Cryptia or Cryptia from hidden, secret, was an ancient Spartan state institution involving young Spartan men. The French historian Henri Jeanmaire points out that the unstructured and covert activities of the Cryptia are unlike the disciplined and well-ordered communal life of the Spartan hoplites. Jeanmaire suggests that the Cryptia was a rite of passage, possibly predating the classical military organization, and may have been preserved through Sparta's legendary religious conservatism. He draws comparison with the initiation rituals of some African secret societies, wolfmen and leopard men. According to Aristotle, the Cryptia were established by the legendary Spartan lawgiver Lycurgus. Every autumn, Spartan ephors would declare war on the Helot population, which would allow them to kill a Helot without fear of punishment. The chosen Crypti were then sent out into the countryside armed with daggers with the instructions to kill any Helot they encountered traveling the roads and tending to fields they deemed too plentiful. They were specifically told to kill the strongest and to take any food they needed. The reason for adopting that practice was to prevent the threat of a Helot rebellion and to keep their population in check. According to some sources, Crypti would stalk the Helot villages and surrounding countryside, spying on the servile population. Their mission was to prevent and to suppress unrest and rebellion. Troublesome Helots could be summarily executed. Such brutal repression of the Helots permitted the Spartan elite to successfully control the servile agrarian population and devote themselves to military practice. In events preceding the 10-year conflict between the Spartans and the Messenians that resulted from the Helot revolt, the Spartan leadership had 2,000 Helots killed who had participated in the war. It is thought that the Cryptia were the primary perpetrators of the massacre or were at least somehow involved in carrying it out. Several theories exist regarding the origin of the name Helot. According to Hellanicus, the word relates to the village of Hellos in the south of Sparta. Pausanias thus states, its inhabitants became the first slaves of the Lacedaemonian state, and were the first to be called Helots. Linguists have associated the word with the root wel, as in to be captured, to be made prisoner. In fact, some ancient authors did not consider the term ethnic, but rather an indication of servitude. Antiochus of Syracuse writes, those of the Lacedaemonians who did not take part in the expedition were adjudged slaves and were named Helots, while Theopompus, cited by Athenaeus, 6:416c, states, and the one nation called their slaves Helots and the others called them Penesti. In all of these texts, the naming of the group as Helots is the central and symbolic moment of their reduction to serfhood. Certainly, conquest comprised one aspect of Helotism, thus Messenians, who were conquered in the Messenian Wars of the 8th century BC, become synonymous in Herodotus with Helots. The situation seems less clear in the case of the earliest Helots, who, according to Theopompus, were descended from the initial Achaeans, whom the Dorians had conquered. But not all Achaeans were reduced to Helotism. The city of Amyclae, home of the Hyacinthia festival, enjoyed special status, as did others. Remember, in our previous webisode we showed that some of the carbon organic Achaeans had supported the Dorians, whilst others had supported the hybrid Asians, albino Ionian Hellenes from Athens, hence the varying treatment. From at least the classical period, the number of carbon organic Spartans was very small in comparison to that of the Helots, as many Pelasgian Dorians had migrated. In a celebrated passage, Thucydides stresses that most Spartan institutions have always been designed with a view to security against the Helots. Aristotle compares them to an enemy constantly sitting in wait of the disaster of the Spartans. Consequently, fear seems to be an important factor governing relations between Spartans and Helots. According to tradition, the Spartiates always carried their spears, undid the straps of their bucklers only when at home, lest the Helots seize them and lock themselves in their homes. They also took active measures, subjecting them to what Theopompus describes as an altogether cruel and bitter condition. According to Myron of Praene, an anti-Spartan historian of the middle 3rd century BC, they assigned to the Helots every shameful task leading to disgrace. For they ordained that each one of them must wear a dogskin cap and wrap himself in skins and receive a stipulated number of beatings every year regardless of any wrongdoing, so that they would never forget they were slaves. Moreover, if any exceeded the vigor proper to a slave's condition, they made death the penalty, and they allotted a punishment to those controlling them if they failed. Plutarch also states that Spartans treated the Helots harshly and cruelly. Grote writes, the various anecdotes which are told respecting Helot treatment at Sparta betoken less of cruelty than of ostentatious scorn. He has been followed recently by J. Duckett, 1974 and 1990, who described Spartan treatment of the Helots as a kind of ideological warfare designed to condition the Helots to think of themselves as inferiors. The Helots were invited by a proclamation to pick out those of their number who claimed to have most distinguished themselves against the enemy, in order that they might receive their freedom, the object being to test them, as it was thought that the first to claim their freedom would be the most high-spirited and the most apt to rebel. As many as 2,000 were selected accordingly, who crowned themselves and went round the temples, rejoicing in their new freedom. The Spartans, however, soon afterwards did away with them, and no one ever knew how each of them perished. Helots were assigned to citizens to carry out domestic work or to work on their cleroi, or portions. Various sources mention such servants accompanying this or that Spartan. Finally, Helots, like slaves, could be artisans or tradesmen. They were required to hand over a predetermined portion of their harvest, with the Helots keeping the surplus. Having paid their tribute, the Helots could often live rather well. Helots lived in family units and could, at least de facto, contract unions among themselves. Since Helots were much less susceptible than other slaves in Greek antiquity to having their family units dispersed, they could reproduce themselves, or at least maintain their number. Probably not insignificant to begin with, their population increased in spite of the Cryptia, other massacres of Helots, and losses in war. Simultaneously, the population of Spartiate citizens declined because in order to keep their ancient Egyptian and Phoenician noble bloodlines pure, they had to find other carbon organic families whom could also trace their family's descent back to their indigenous origins of royalty. Since the Helot population was not technically chattel, their population was reliant on native birth rates, as opposed to prisoners of war or purchased slaves. Helots were encouraged by the Spartans to impose a eugenics doctrine similar to that which they, themselves, practiced. This would, according to Greek beliefs of the period, ensure not only genetic but also acquired favorable characteristics be passed along to successive generations. Tempering these selective factors was the Cryptia, during which the strongest and fittest Helots were the primary targets of the Cryptes. To select soft targets would be interpreted as a sign of weakness. This theoretically removed the strongest and most able potential rebels while keeping the general populace fit and efficient. What is more, the Spartans used Helot women to satisfy the state's human personnel needs. The bastards born of Spartan fathers and Helot women held an intermediary rank in Lacedaemonian society and swelled the ranks of the citizen army. Thus, Paul Cartledge claims that the history of Sparta is fundamentally the history of the class struggle between the Spartans and the Helots. So, let's review what we have uncovered thus far in regard to the Hellenes, whom are the hybrid Asian albinos that currently populate the Anatolian and Balkan Peninsula. Point 1 is that they entered the region about 2000 BC, which means that they are not the same as the original inhabitants of the region, being the carbon organic tribes, families, and clans from both ancient Africa and Mesopotamia. Point 2, the Hellenes didn't just relearn how to read and write. This is a preposterous suggestion by Western academia to hide the lie of what really was occurring in the region. Obviously, it was the carbon organic Phoenician influence from the Dorians, whom still resided in the region as the ruling powers, who taught them because they were completely illiterate, and in order to be a workforce they had to be upgraded academically, no different than what occurred during the Industrial Revolution. Also, they had to change the language and match letters to sounds, producing vowels, as much of the ancient sounds utilized and the way the language was constructed could not be understood by these barbarians, so we had to find an easier way for them to learn. This method was even adopted to make both Arabic and Hebrew understood by the now new hybrid Asian albino converts to both Islam and Judaism, as the languages in their original forms also had no vowels. Point 3. The history that they claimed as their own was passed down by the original carbon organic tribes, families, and clans by bards over the years. The histories and legends passed down were of the original carbon organic founders of the region and has nothing to do with the hybrid Asian albino usurpers who claimed the history as their own, which was a common trait for the Amnea steppe herders / Caucasian hunter-gatherers. Point 4. The root of the word Hellenes is the word Kel, which explains their history as the cave or cavern dwellers from their time in the Caucasus Mountain region. Point 5. Also in the root word we also find to conceal or to cover, and we must be clear that they have made efforts since their inception to hide not only their origins, but the origins of all others, especially carbon organic peoples. They were the cavemen when the carbon organic tribes, families, and clans had flourishing cultures and societies globally. Point 6. Their home was the entrance to Hades, god of the dead, and we will note that hybrid Asian albino culture has a fascination with death, and death cults, including their religions and forms of spirituality. Point 7. One of the most revealing things we have uncovered is the truth that the hybrid Asian albino Hellenes were Helots or slaves to the carbon organic tribes, families, and clans, namely the Dorians, who we discussed in the previous webisode, whom became Spartans, then becoming the Macedonians, which we will cover soon. The Helots could be killed at will. The strongest was targeted to stop rebellions. They were treated extremely cruelly, and their women were used for pleasure. This reality is something that carbon organic people must learn and address. As a people, we have had the Caucasian under bondage since their inception. Carbon organic people had them in bondage for thousands of years, and they have received the most cruel treatment, which they have hidden except for a few brave authors on the matter. Much of what carbon organic people endure today is a reflection of what our ancestors in time past have done unto others. If you follow this series completely to its conclusion, you will see that the hybrid Asian albinos have only recently received freedom, but they completely falsified history to hide these facts. The Archive of Nations will document all the steps in the narrative so that all people have a clear understanding in regard to how we got here, and most of all, what must be done collectively to lawfully change the status quo. And when we mean lawfully, we mean it in accordance to universal law. Thank you for watching this webisode, and we hope you will be back for part 2 of Hell, Hellenes, and the Draconian demon race. Join us on the next episode as we continue to unravel the mysteries of our past to create a better blueprint for the future for all fallen humanity. This series, The Claim of Thrones, will take you on a journey through the universe, across the galactic heavens to the eventual seeding of the planet Earth. This series will also cover the hidden realities of how humanity came about, the various cataclysms and restarts, and follow the various bloodlines of indigenous rights of inheritance. This narrative sets the sacred record straight in regards to who's who on the planet Earth and begins the journey of the lawful reversion and restitution for the heirs of Mother Earth. If you like this content, please subscribe and hit the notification button, as well as support across our many social media platforms.